mad, sad, and impossible to know when he would fling himself into a violent rage or burst into song. That's the image of George III that has lasted, the king who went mad. But those final years of insanity were, in fact, the tragic end to a reign which, in the face of enormous upheavals, had been one of the most popular in British history. This was a king who cared passionately about Britain. He was a king who believed that monarchs were born to rule, not simply turn out for parades. Yet he was also the king who lost it all. He lost his power to control Parliament, he lost his power to control his colonies, and in the end, he lost the power to control his own mind. (1760), a royal messenger bringing news from Kensington Palace that George II was dying. Prince George, his grandson, was out riding near his favourite palace at Kew when the messenger arrived. The news that he was about to become the king was a shock for the 22-year-old, but the people welcomed him like a breath of fresh air. George III was intelligent, tall and spirited. He was inheriting a kingdom in good shape. Everything boded well. He was the first king in decades to be born and raised in Britain. His predecessors, George I and George II, had been very much Hanoverian Germans. They'd been brought over to stabilise the monarchy after it had become so unpopular in the 17th century. But being foreigners, they'd never been really accepted. George I didn't even speak English. George III planned to do things very differently. The man who, above all others, shaped his ideas was his tutor, the Earl of Bute. John Stuart Bute had been a lord of the bedchamber to George's father, Prince Frederick, though Frederick had held a pretty low opinion of him. Bute would make an excellent ambassador, he said, in some proud little court where there is nothing to do. When Frederick died, Bute soon slipped into the role of tutor and father figure to the young prince, who became devoted to him. Bute was a reliable friend. He offered George good advice about marriage, steering him towards the young German princess Charlotte, whom George married in September 1761. But Bute also planted the idea that George was living in a wicked age when men would stop at nothing to attack the crown. Previous Hanoverian kings had surrendered considerable power to the dominant Whig party and its forceful ministers. Whilst he accepted the superiority of Parliament, George felt that he should have a Prime Minister whose support he could count on. In May 1762, without reference to Parliament, he gave Bute the job. It was a disastrous decision made by a young and inexperienced king. For Bute, essentially, was a behind-the-scenes operator with virtually no political experience. He made a hopeless Prime Minister. He could never command the respect of the heavyweight parliamentarians, Lord Newcastle, William Pitt. They thought him pompous and a political coward. Outside Parliament, Bute was a figure of fun, partly because he was known to be having an affair with George's mother.
Go on, big on!
After less than a year in office, he was desperate to resign. "If I had but £50 per annum," he wrote, "I would retire on bread and water and think it luxury compared with what I suffer." The king felt let down. Having no faith in politicians, there was no one he could turn to. He could only achieve his ambitions for the monarchy through his ministers, and yet he seemed unable to find a prime minister he could get on with and who in turn would dominate Parliament. The result was a bad press. Despite their best efforts, the king and his advisers became the targets for some merciless mockery from journalists. And one journalist stood above the rest. John Wilkes. That devil Wilkes, as George called him, was an MP as well as editor of a Republican newspaper, the North Briton. In 1763, there was a scandal. Edition number 45 openly criticised George, suggesting he was a liar. The government issued a general warrant for the arrest of anyone involved in its publication. Wilkes was charged and sent to the Tower. From there, he complained that as a Member of Parliament, he could not be imprisoned for speaking his mind. At the time, Britain considered itself one of the more liberal, enlightened countries of Europe. A howl of public protest went up. The right to free speech was being threatened. And then, as Parliament debated the issue, Wilkes was released. The king was horrified. No man was more threatening to his idea of kingship than Wilkes. He had to be stopped. With trouble brewing, Wilkes fled to France. And George gained a few years' peace. He might still be wrangling with his ministers, and there were protests in America against British taxes, but at least he was spared the jibes of John Wilkes. Then, 5 years later, Wilkes was back, and so were the riots. Wilkes was elected MP for Middlesex. George was appalled. The night of the poll, the London mob roamed the streets, shouting, "Wilkes and no king!" They smashed windows and chalked up 45, a copy of the North Briton, which had so outraged the king. George was truly astonished. He thought the country was on the brink of anarchy. But the king and his ministers' real concern was to stop Wilkes taking up his seat. So he was charged again with his old crime of seditious libel. In court, he was fined £1,000 and given 22 months in prison. This time, though, when the news broke, the riots lasted several days. On the 10th of May, a magistrate, fearing rebellion, ordered troops onto the streets.
Ready, your fire
Fire! 6 people were killed and dozens wounded. It came to be known as the Massacre of St. George's Fields, and the king won himself no friends by expressing his approval of the magistrate's decision. But the man who discovered the secret of how to deal with Wilkes was the new Prime Minister, Lord North, whom George appointed in 1770. North had a relaxed, imperturbable, and some said sleepy manner. He decided that the best thing to do with Wilkes was ignore him, and it proved surprisingly effective. For without the court cases and the arrests, the satiric jibes of Wilkes seemed, well, pointless. And George felt that in North he'd at last found someone he could trust and work with. But their relationship would be put to a severe test when the biggest crisis of George's reign erupted in America. 10 years into his reign, King George III had a prime minister he trusted. On the home front, at least, things seemed in order. But there was trouble overseas. Relations between Britain and her 13 American colonies had been difficult for years. For the British, the colonies were expensive to administer. Various futile attempts had been made to get them to pay for their own defence. But the colonists saw themselves as independent states, capable of making independent policy. George fervently believed that the colonists were part of Britain and should pay taxes like any other British subjects. The Americans retorted that without American members having a say in Parliament, this was an outrageous threat to liberty. The Assembly of Massachusetts declared, "No taxation without representation." The colonists were in no mood to cooperate. This was the antagonism Lord North faced when he became Prime Minister. His answer, as always, was to try to calm things down. He offered to remove all the duties except tea. The king agreed. "There must always be one tax to keep up the right," he said, "and as such, I approve of the tea duty." But the problem with taxing tea was that tea, that quintessential British beverage, had come to symbolise colonial independence. Much of it was smuggled in America, and North's plan was to undercut the smugglers, make tea cheaper, and win back the loyalty of the colonists. But the Americans were having none of this. On the 16th of December, 1773, 5,000 of them gathered here at Boston's Old South Meeting House to register their protest. Several days later, a band of rebels led by Samuel Adams boarded British ships here in Boston Harbour, and they tipped 40 tons of tea into the water. No one really wanted a war, but neither side was prepared to back down. The king declared, "The colonies must either submit or triumph. I do not wish to come to severer measures, but we must not retreat." North, in the meantime, wanted to give the colonists a let-out. If they paid for their own justice and defence, he said, Britain would drop the taxes. It might have worked, but before the idea was even considered, fighting broke out, and war was inevitable. As the army made ready for the conflict, news reached the king of skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. The first reports were from rebel sources and emphasised the brutality of the British. It was going to be a fierce fight. On July the 4th, 1776, the rebel leaders issued their Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, it says, and it goes on, they have a right to be governed by those who derive their powers from the consent of the governed. That meant no British rule. The war initially favoured the British. New York was captured in 1776. Philadelphia, the seat of Congress, the year after. North took little pleasure in these early successes, but the king was exuberant. He made a careful study of military strategy and spent hours poring over dispatches and army maps. He was convinced of victory. But then in 1777, a plan to cut off New England went disastrously wrong. The idea was that General Burgoyne would march south from Quebec in order to meet General Howe's army coming up from Pennsylvania. Their combined forces would then split the colonists and cut off their lines of supply and communication. But Howe was delayed and never made it. At Saratoga in Upper New York State, the British suffered a heavy defeat. It was a major turning point, and Saratoga produced confusion at home. In Parliament, both the elder statesman William Pitt and the radical spokesman Charles James Fox made vehement speeches against the war. But George was resolute. Saratoga, he said, had been very serious, but not without remedy. He refused to accept the resignation of Lord North. The war was becoming almost his personal campaign to keep his kingdom intact. And as he told his cabinet, he'd rather lose his life than see his dominions dismembered. So the war stumbled on. Ironically, although Saratoga demoralized the government, it had quite the opposite effect on the country. Men were suddenly eager to fight for their king. George knew that Britain's hopes lay in the south, where the majority of loyalists were. Redcoats marched through Virginia, taking Charleston, the capital of the South, in 1780. But they were overconfident and got caught out when America's allies, the French, landed 3,000 men by sea, and Lord Cornwallis's army found itself trapped by Washington's troops at Yorktown. The British came under heavy fire, and as the colonists advanced on several fronts, they swiftly surrounded the Redcoats. To fight on seemed pointless. Cornwallis ordered his men to lay down their arms, and so a once royal colony effectively became a republic. The loss of the colonies was deeply painful for George. His ambition to be seen as a good and fair king, a figure of unity, seemed to be at an end, and from the early 1780s, his withdrawal from the politics of London was noticeable. He and Queen Charlotte spent more time at Windsor, where he could indulge his interest in farming and the countryside. He had 3 farms there of over 1,000 acres, which earned him the nickname Farmer George. But in the summer of 1788, the king's life took a sudden and irreversible change of direction. He went mad. It started with abdominal pains, and everyone thought they'd go away, but they didn't. Here's one of the many letters that he wrote to William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister. "I cannot help thanking Mr. Pitt for his attention in postponing an audience till Friday, that I may be the sooner quite recovered." But he didn't. His urine began to go a strange colour. He began to chatter incessantly. The doctors said he must be mad. Well, we know now that what he was suffering from was porphyria, a hereditary disease that produces dementia. He thought he could see Hanover through a telescope. He thought London was about to be flooded. They put him into a straitjacket. He took his son by the shoulders and sobbed, "I wish to God I may die. I'm going to be mad." There were calls to make the king's son George Prince Regent. The younger George was a womanizer and a gambler, and his debts at one point reached £500,000. That's 30 million today. But the prince also meant trouble of a different kind. He was a close friend of the Whig leader Charles James Fox, who loathed George III, who loathed him back. It must have felt to the king as though the political poison of the radicals had seeped under his front door. Politically, this was a crisis. If the prince were made regent, the odious Fox would be in, and the king's friend, Pitt the Younger, out. Fortunately for George, in February 1789, when Parliament was on the brink of passing a Regency bill, he began to mend. Prayers were sent to churches across Britain, giving thanks for his recovery. The king was now popular again. Apart from his illness, there was France. As the bloody reality of the French Revolution became known, the British people realized how fond they were of their king and how much they preferred him to an arrogant, strutting emperor like Napoleon. George did little to court this public affection. He never visited Wales or Scotland, let alone America or India. In fact, he scarcely strayed beyond the south of England. But from the early 1800s, that was perhaps because he daren't. The truth was that he was living in the shadow of a disease that wouldn't go away. Porphyria struck him again in 1801, and for a third time in 1804. And although he seemed to recover from these increasingly violent bouts, his family grew fearful. Queen Charlotte now refused to share his bed. She'd been married to him for 40 years, borne him 15 children, but now they drifted apart. And then, to make matters worse, he began to lose his eyesight. George now plunged into the darkness of his own private hell. The final devastating attack came in 1810. The king was 72. Within 3 months, a bill was passed giving full sovereign powers to the Prince Regent, and this time George seemed not to mind. He thought he could summon up the dead, and that he was secretly married to a lady at court, the Countess of Pembroke. In the outside world, the Duke of Wellington was busy defeating Napoleon. Waterloo, one of the greatest victories in British history, went unnoticed. Instead, George bashed away at his battered harpsichord and told no one in particular that this was an air much admired by Mr. Handel. Sadly, without knowing it, George was at the height of his popularity. When he died at Windsor in January 1820, he was still the patriot prince, a father figure, fiercely loyal to his country. He was not the frustrated absolute monarch some alleged. He always believed in the primacy of Parliament. But his hope to retain the power to appoint his ministers did, in the end, fail. The great irony of his reign is that he was a king who sought to restore royal status, but instead saw political power exchanged for symbolic power. Unwittingly, George was the one who ushered in the system that we have today, constitutional monarchy.
This extraordinary object is an egg boiler designed for King George III. It's made from gilded silver and includes a burner with a wick, a vessel to contain the boiling water, and a holder for up to 4 eggs, with an hourglass at the top. The hourglass times the eggs for 3 minutes for a soft boiled consistency. The boiler was part of a breakfast service given to the king by 5 of his youngest daughters in 1804 as a birthday gift. The service includes egg cups engraved with George III's cipher, as well as those of each of the princesses.